The wind cut sharp at 3,000 feet above the Appalachian ridges. Caleb Morrison learned that his first winter in western West Virginia in 1889, when his cabin dropped to 20 degrees inside, while he fed log after log into his cast iron stove, burning through 6 cords of hardwood by February and still waking to ice on his water bucket. He had built and heated his cabin exactly the way every mountain homesteader was told to do it. Good hardwood, hot flames, open hearth when wood ran low, standard and proven. Across the high country, settlers were losing the same battle against brutal cold, burning massive amounts of fuel and still shivering through the nights. Over the next 2 winters, Caleb quietly adapted an old technique from his immigrant grandfather's coal mining days to heat his cabin through the coldest snaps without touching a single piece of firewood. What did he understand about slow-burning fuel that every serious homesteader should know? The neighbors thought Caleb Morrison was losing his mind when he started hauling dusty coal lumps up the ridge instead of splitting oak logs like every sensible man in the hollow. John Byrne, whose cabin sat just a quarter-mile down the slope, made sure everyone at the general store heard about Morrison's fool notion. "Man's got perfectly good timber all around him," Byrne would say, gesturing toward the thick hardwood stands that blanketed the West Virginia mountains. "But he's down there scraping black rocks off the ground like some kind of miner." What Byrne and the other settlers didn't understand was that Caleb Morrison was part miner. His grandfather Robert had worked the small coal seams in the Scottish Highlands before crossing the Atlantic, and his father had spent 2 seasons in the early mining camps near Beckley before taking up farming. The Morrison family carried coal dust in their blood, along with memories of techniques that most American homesteaders had never needed to learn. But now, facing his second winter in these mountains, Caleb was beginning to think those old country methods might be exactly what he needed. The conventional wisdom that governed heating in the Appalachian ridges was simple and seemingly foolproof. Every cabin builder knew the formula. Thick hardwood logs burned hot and clean, cast iron stoves could handle anything you fed them, and when wood ran scarce, you could always toss a few lumps of the surface coal onto the fire as backup fuel. The method had kept mountain families warm for decades. It made perfect sense until you actually tried to burn coal the same way you burned wood. Caleb had learned that lesson the hard way during his first winter. The surface coal that lay exposed along the ridge outcroppings burned hot enough, but when he threw it into his stove the way he would add a log, thick yellow smoke poured into his cabin. The sulfurous smell made his eyes water and sent his wife Mary outside to gulp fresh air. Worse yet, the coal would flare bright for an hour, then die down to nothing, leaving the stove cold while chunks of unburned fuel sat in the ash. His neighbor Byrne, who had tried the same approach, gave up on coal entirely after one smoky night that left soot streaking down his cabin walls. But Caleb's grandfather had told him stories about coal fires that burned steady and clean for entire nights, banked under layers of ash in the highland cottages. The old man described how miners would build deep beds of coal, let them burn down to glowing embers, then cover the whole mass with ash to slow the burn and trap the heat. It wasn't the bright flame that mattered, Robert Morrison had explained, but the steady glow that could last 20 hours without tending. The technique sounded like folklore until Caleb saw it working at Tom Ridley's mining camp blacksmith shop. Ridley kept his forge fire alive overnight by banking coals under a thick layer of ash, throttling the bellows to barely a whisper, and letting the deep bed of embers radiate heat without flame. In the morning, a few strokes of the bellows would bring the fire roaring back to full heat. The forge stayed warm, the coal lasted 3 times longer than open burning, and there was no smoke to speak of. Watching Ridley work, Caleb began to understand what his grandfather had been trying to explain. Wood fires needed flame and fresh air to burn hot, but coal fires worked differently. The key was controlling the air supply and building enough fuel mass to hold heat over time. Too much air made coal burn too fast with choking smoke. Too little air snuffed the fire entirely, but the right balance with the right depth of fuel bed could produce steady heat for hours. That winter, while his neighbors continued splitting wood and cursing the coal smoke, Caleb quietly began experimenting with banking techniques in his own stove. He started by building deeper beds of coal, instead of scattering a few lumps over dying wood coals. When the coal burned down to red embers, he covered it with an inch or two of ash and fine coal dust, then adjusted his stove damper to allow just enough draft to keep the fire alive without flame. The results were inconsistent at first. Sometimes he smothered the fire completely. Other times he used too little ash and the coal flared back into smoky flames that filled his cabin. But gradually, through trial and observation, he learned to read the fire. The color of the ash told him about the heat beneath. The sound of the draft told him about the airflow. The feel of warmth radiating from the stove told him when the banking was working properly. By March, Caleb had refined his technique enough to keep his cabin at 60 degrees through entire nights, using half the coal that open burning required. The fire stayed clean, the heat stayed steady, and most importantly, the method was reliable. He could bank the stove at 9 in the evening and find warm embers still glowing at 7 the next morning, ready to spring back to full heat with a few fresh lumps and some air. His success didn't go unnoticed, but it didn't win him any popularity contests either. The timber cutters who made their living selling cordwood to homesteaders saw Caleb's coal experiments as a threat to their business. Some of the older settlers viewed his departure from proven wood-burning methods as dangerous innovation that might leave his family freezing if the coal ran out. Even Mary Morrison worried that her husband was spending too much time fussing with fires instead of splitting the oak and hickory that grew thick around their clearing. But Caleb had seen enough to know he was onto something significant. This wasn't just about coal versus wood, or even about saving money on fuel. This was about understanding fire itself, about working with combustion instead of simply feeding it. The old Highland miners had developed these techniques over generations of burning poor-quality coal in harsh conditions. They had learned to make fuel last, to extract every bit of heat, to keep fires alive through long, cold nights when failure meant death. Now, as winter approached again, Caleb Morrison was ready to put that traditional knowledge to a real test. The first serious test came in December of 1889, when temperatures dropped to 10 degrees and stayed there for 3 straight days. While John Byrne and the other neighbors fed log after log into their stoves, cursing the cold that seemed to suck heat right through their cabin walls, Caleb Morrison was conducting the most important experiment of his life. He had spent weeks perfecting the measurements and timing that would make his grandfather's banking method work in an American frontier cabin, and now winter was demanding proof. The key difference lay in understanding fuel bed depth. Most homesteaders, when they bothered with coal at all, scattered a thin layer of lumps over their wood coals the way they might add kindling to a dying fire. But Caleb had learned from watching Tom Ridley's forge that effective coal banking required mass, real thermal mass. He began by building his coal bed 2 feet deep in the firebox of his cast iron stove, carefully layering the lumps so air could flow between them during the initial burn phase. The coal he gathered from the ridge outcroppings was bituminous, soft enough to break with a hammer, but hard enough to hold its shape when stacked. Each lump was roughly the size of a man's fist, small enough to pack tightly, but large enough to burn slowly. The surface coal in these West Virginia mountains contained sulfur, which created the choking smoke when burned with too much air. But Caleb had discovered that sulfur wasn't the enemy if you controlled the combustion properly. Building the fire required patience that most frontier settlers couldn't spare. Caleb would start with dry kindling at the bottom of his deep coal bed, lighting it just as he would a wood fire. As the kindling caught and began heating the coal above, the lumps would start to smoke and release their volatile gases. This was the critical moment that defeated most attempts at coal burning, because the natural response was to open the damper and give the fire more air to clear the smoke. Instead, Caleb had learned to let the coal burn hot and bright for exactly 1 hour, allowing the volatile gases to burn away and the lumps to transform into glowing coke. When the flames died down and the coal bed glowed cherry red throughout its 2-foot depth, Caleb would begin the banking process that separated his method from common frontier practice. Using a long-handled shovel, he would spread a layer of ash and fine coal dust 6 inches thick over the entire surface of the glowing bed. The ash came from previous fires mixed with coal dust that he collected by breaking up the smallest pieces of coal until they were nearly powder. This blanket had to be thick enough to cut off most of the air supply, but not so thick that it completely smothered the fire. The physics of what happened next had taken Caleb months to understand through observation and experimentation. The ash layer acted as insulation, trapping heat in the coal bed, while allowing just enough oxygen to seep through to maintain slow combustion. Instead of the rapid oxidation that created flames and smoke, the banked coal burned through a process more like charcoal making, converting slowly to coke while radiating steady heat. The deep mass of the 2-foot bed meant that even as the surface cooled, the interior remained hot enough to keep the entire system active. Temperature control came through the stove's damper system. With the coal bed properly banked, Caleb would close the damper until it was barely open, creating just enough draft to pull combustion gases up the chimney without drawing in enough fresh air to restart flaming. The balance was delicate. Too much air and the banking would fail, sending flames and smoke back into the cabin. Too little air, and the fire would die completely, leaving him with a stove full of cold coal and ash. The results of his first successful banking exceeded even his expectations. On that December night, when the temperature outside dropped to 10 degrees, Caleb banked his fire at 9 in the evening and went to bed confident but uncertain. When he woke at 7 the next morning, his cabin thermometer read 68 degrees. The stove was still radiating heat, and when he carefully raked back a section of the ash blanket, red coals glowed beneath, ready to spring back to full fire with the addition of fresh coal and air. His neighbor John Byrne, burning wood in a similar-sized cabin just a quarter-mile away, had fed his fire 3 times during the night and still woke to an interior temperature of 35 degrees. Byrne had burned through nearly a full cord of split oak in those 3 days of cold weather. Caleb had used approximately 1/3 that amount of coal, and his fire had required attention only once every 24 hours instead of every few hours. The fuel efficiency was remarkable, but the consistency proved even more valuable. Wood fires burned hot and fast, creating cycles of overheating and cooling that made frontier cabins uncomfortable and inefficient. The banked coal fire maintained steady heat output that kept cabin temperatures within a narrow range. More importantly, the technique was reliable. Once Caleb mastered the ash thickness and damper settings, he could bank a fire with confidence that it would perform predictably for the next 18 to 24 hours. Word of his success traveled slowly through the mountain community, mostly through Mary Morrison's conversations with other wives at the general store. Women noticed when a neighbor's cabin stayed warm without constant tending, especially when their own husbands were splitting wood and hauling logs from dawn to dusk just to keep the cold at bay. Some of the men remained skeptical, convinced that any method that didn't produce visible flames couldn't be generating real heat. But the mathematics were undeniable. By the end of that winter, Caleb had used 2 tons of surface coal to heat his cabin through 4 months of mountain weather. His neighbor's burning wood had consumed between 6 and 8 cords of hardwood, representing far more labor in cutting, splitting, and hauling. The coal cost him nothing but the labor of gathering it from exposed seams along the ridge. The wood cost his neighbors days of backbreaking work that took time away from other essential frontier tasks. The banking method had proven itself, but Caleb was already thinking beyond basic fuel efficiency. His success with combustion control had taught him that heating a frontier cabin required more than just managing the fire itself. Even with his coal banking perfected, Caleb Morrison faced a problem that no amount of fuel efficiency could solve. Heat was escaping his cabin faster than any fire could replace it. On calm nights, his banked coal system maintained comfortable temperatures, but when the mountain winds picked up, he could feel cold air streaming through gaps in his log walls, around his doorframe, and up through cracks in his plank floor. The banking method had proven that steady combustion was only half the battle. The other half was keeping that heat inside where it belonged. The problem became obvious during a January night when outside temperatures hit 0 degrees. Despite his perfectly banked fire glowing steadily beneath its ash blanket, the cabin temperature dropped from 68 degrees at bedtime to 45 degrees by morning. Caleb could feel the answer in the cold drafts that crept across the floor and the way heat seemed to vanish into the walls themselves. His neighbors faced the same challenge, but attacked it with the frontier solution of burning more fuel. Caleb had learned enough about combustion efficiency to know that wasn't the answer. The first breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A Yonah, an elder from the Cherokee-influenced community further down the mountain, had observed Caleb gathering coal near the ridge outcroppings and struck up a conversation about winter survival. When Caleb mentioned the cold drafts that plagued his cabin, a Yonah described techniques his people used for sealing log structures against mountain weather. The method involved creating a paste from local clay, dried moss, and small twigs that could be worked into the gaps between logs, then covered with additional moss for insulation. The Cherokee approach differed fundamentally from the mud chinking that most white settlers used. Instead of simply filling gaps with whatever clay they could find, a Yonah's technique required specific materials gathered at specific times. The clay had to be collected from stream banks during dry weather, when it contained the least amount of organic matter that would shrink and crack when dried. The moss came from north-facing tree trunks, where it grew thick and retained moisture longer than sun-exposed moss. The twigs were gathered from willow or birch, species that remained flexible even when dried. Working with a Yonah over several weekends, Caleb learned to prepare the chinking mixture by combining 3 parts clay with 1 part moss that had been pulled apart into fine strands. The willow twigs, each no thicker than a pencil and cut into 3-inch lengths, were mixed throughout to act as binding reinforcement. The paste had to be wet enough to work into narrow gaps, but dry enough to hold its shape without slumping. Getting the consistency right took practice, but once mastered, the mixture could seal cracks as narrow as a knife blade or as wide as a man's thumb. The chinking process required working from both inside and outside the cabin, pressing the clay mixture deep into each gap between logs, then smoothing it flush with the wood surface. Over the mixture, a Yonah showed Caleb how to press additional dry moss, creating an insulation layer that would trap air and provide backup sealing if the clay cracked during winter freeze cycles. The work was tedious but methodical, requiring about 2 days to properly seal all the gaps in Caleb's cabin walls. While working on the chinking, Caleb noticed that a Yonah paid careful attention to how the cabin was positioned relative to the mountain slopes and prevailing winds. The elder explained that Cherokee builders always considered wind patterns when positioning their winter shelters, using natural features to block cold winds while capturing whatever sun was available during short winter days. Caleb's cabin faced northeast, which caught morning sun but left it exposed to the harsh northwest winds that carried the worst of the mountain weather. Repositioning the cabin wasn't practical, but Caleb could modify his structure to work better with the natural forces around it. Following techniques his grandfather Robert had described from Scottish Highland cottages, he built an earth berm against the north and west walls of his cabin using soil, stones, and packed leaves. The berm rose 3 feet high against the walls, creating a barrier that deflected wind and added insulation where the cabin was most exposed to weather. The thermal mass solution came from observing heat patterns around Tom Ridley's blacksmith shop. Ridley had positioned large stones around his forge, and Caleb noticed that these stones continued radiating warmth long after the fire died down. The principle was simple but effective. Stone absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly throughout the night, smoothing out temperature fluctuations and storing energy that would otherwise be lost. Caleb gathered flat sandstone slabs from a nearby creek bed, each piece weighing between 15 and 20 pounds. He positioned them in 2 strategic locations inside his cabin. The first arrangement created a platform directly beneath his stove, using stones fitted tightly together to form a solid base about 4 feet square. The second arrangement lined the wall behind the stove, creating a stone backdrop that would absorb radiant heat and reflect it back into the room. In total, the stone installations added approximately 100 pounds of thermal mass to his heating system. The positioning required careful calculation. Stones placed too close to the stove would absorb heat so quickly that they reduced the fire's immediate warming effect. Stones placed too far away received insufficient heat to make a meaningful contribution. Through experimentation, Caleb determined that the optimal distance was 18 inches between the stove and the wall stones, with the floor stones in direct contact with the stove's base. The combined effect of chinking, berming, and thermal mass became apparent during the next cold snap. When outside temperatures dropped to 0 degrees, Caleb's cabin maintained 62 degrees throughout the night, compared to the 45 degrees he had experienced before the modifications. More importantly, the temperature remained stable. Instead of fluctuating with the fire's burning cycles, the stone mass absorbed excess heat during the evening and released it steadily until morning. The fuel savings were immediate and measurable. With better heat retention, Caleb's coal consumption dropped by an additional 15% beyond what his banking method had already achieved. His neighbors, still fighting drafts with bigger fires, were burning nearly 3 times the fuel that Caleb required for superior comfort. The difference represented not just cost savings, but hours of daily labor that Caleb could spend on other essential frontier tasks. Mary Morrison noticed changes beyond simple warmth. The cabin felt different, more solid, and settled. The constant small drafts that had made certain corners uncomfortable disappeared entirely. The stone surfaces provided places to warm clothing and boots, making winter mornings less harsh. Most significantly, the system required less attention, freeing both of them from the constant cycle of feeding fires and managing heat that dominated their neighbors' winter routines. By spring, Caleb had created an integrated system that addressed heating as a complete challenge rather than simply a matter of burning fuel. The success of Caleb's integrated heating system created an unexpected problem that nearly derailed his entire project. By February of 1890, his perfectly sealed cabin with its banked coal fire was producing indoor air that made breathing uncomfortable on certain nights. The coal banking method that had solved his fuel efficiency problems was now creating a different challenge that his neighbors, for all their wasteful wood burning, didn't face. Clean combustion and proper ventilation, Caleb discovered, were entirely separate technical problems that required their own solutions. The issue became serious during a week of still, cold weather, when temperatures outside held steady near 0 degrees. With no wind to create natural draft through his chimney, the banked coal fire began producing trace amounts of sulfurous gas that accumulated in his sealed cabin. The concentration wasn't dangerous, but it was noticeable enough to cause headaches and leave a metallic taste that lingered for hours. Mary Morrison complained of burning eyes on several mornings, and Caleb realized that his success with heat retention had created an indoor air quality problem that could make his system unusable. Most frontier settlers never encountered this challenge because their cabins leaked air so badly that natural ventilation prevented any buildup of combustion gases. John Burns' drafty cabin might be cold and inefficient, but it never suffered from stale air or gas accumulation. Caleb's tight chinking and careful sealing had solved the heat loss problem, but created a new need for controlled fresh air exchange that maintained warmth while ensuring breathable indoor air. The solution came from Tom Ridley, whose mining camp experience included techniques for managing coal gas in enclosed spaces. Ridley had worked in early mining operations where coal dust fires in confined areas required careful ventilation to prevent gas buildup that could sicken or even kill workers. The mining camp blacksmiths used a system called a smoke trap, a small chamber built adjacent to the forge that captured volatile gases before they could escape into work areas. Ridley showed Caleb how to construct a simple smoke trap using materials available on any frontier homestead. The device consisted of a small iron box, roughly the size of a bread loaf, positioned in the stovepipe between the stove and the main chimney. The box had an inlet pipe that connected to the stove and an outlet pipe that led to the chimney, but inside the box was a series of metal baffles that forced the hot gases to change direction several times before exiting. The baffling system worked by cooling the combustion gases, just enough to cause the heaviest particles and some of the sulfur compounds to condense and settle in the bottom of the trap box. The cooled, partially cleaned gases then continued up the chimney, while the condensed material could be emptied from the trap every few days. The device didn't eliminate all combustion byproducts, but it reduced the sulfurous smell significantly and prevented the accumulation of gases that caused headaches and eye irritation. Building the smoke trap required metalworking skills that most homesteaders didn't possess, but Ridley helped Caleb fabricate one using scrap iron from the mining camp. The critical measurements were precise. The inlet and outlet pipes had to be the same diameter as the stovepipe to maintain proper draft, while the internal chamber needed to be large enough to allow gas cooling without restricting flow. The baffles, cut from thin sheet iron, were positioned to create a zigzag path that maximized contact time between the gases and the cooling metal surfaces. Installation required cutting into Caleb's existing stovepipe and inserting the trap box in a vertical section where gravity would help settle the condensed particles. The trap had to be positioned where it could be easily accessed for cleaning, but close enough to the stove that the gases would still be hot enough to maintain chimney draft. After several adjustments, Caleb found that mounting the trap 3 feet above the stove provided the optimal balance of cooling and draft maintenance. The second innovation addressed a problem Caleb had noticed with extended banking periods. When he left his coal bed undisturbed for more than 12 hours, the ash blanket would become so thick and compacted that combustion efficiency declined, leading to incomplete burning and increased gas production. The solution was a scheduled refresh protocol that maintained optimal burning conditions without breaking the banking cycle. Every 12 hours, Caleb would use a long iron rod to gently rake a small section of the ash blanket, creating channels that allowed fresh air to reach the coal bed beneath. This partial stirring reactivated combustion in the deepest parts of the fuel bed, ensuring that coal continued converting efficiently to coke instead of smoldering incompletely. The technique required careful timing and light touch, enough to refresh the fire without destroying the ash insulation that maintained steady heat output. The refresh protocol also involved adding small amounts of fresh coal and coal dust to replace fuel that had been consumed during the previous 12-hour period. Unlike the initial banking process, these additions were minimal, usually no more than 2 or 3 lumps placed strategically over the raked areas. The fresh fuel would ignite from the refreshed embers below, maintaining the deep bed structure while extending the banking period indefinitely. Mastering the refresh technique took weeks of practice. Too much raking would break the banking and send flames shooting up the chimney. Too little raking would allow the fire to gradually suffocate under its own ash. The correct approach involved reading the color and texture of the ash surface to determine where the bed needed attention, then making minimal interventions that supported continued slow burning. The combined effect of smoke trapping and refresh protocols transformed Caleb's heating system from a fuel-efficient method into a complete environmental control solution. During a test period in March, when outside temperatures fluctuated between 20 and 40 degrees, his cabin maintained steady interior temperatures of 65 to 70 degrees with clean, breathable air. The smoke trap eliminated the sulfurous odors that had plagued earlier banking attempts, while the refresh protocol ensured consistent heat output without the temperature swings that characterized wood-burning systems. The air quality improvement was immediately noticeable to anyone who entered the Morrison cabin. Visitors commented on the absence of smoke smell, the steady warmth, and the comfortable atmosphere that contrasted sharply with typical frontier cabins that alternated between overheated and cold, smoky and drafty. Mary Morrison reported that her headaches disappeared entirely once the smoke trap was installed and the refresh protocol established. The system's reliability proved especially valuable during periods of changing weather when atmospheric pressure affected chimney draft. The smoke trap and controlled banking method continued working effectively even when natural draft was poor, maintaining both heat output and air quality under conditions that made traditional wood fires difficult to manage. By late spring, Caleb had developed a complete heating technology that addressed fuel efficiency, heat retention, and indoor air quality as integrated challenges requiring coordinated solutions. The winter of 1891 delivered the test that would prove whether Caleb Morrison's integrated system could handle the worst conditions the Appalachian Mountains could deliver. Starting in late January, a high-pressure system settled over West Virginia and held temperatures between 0 and 20 below degrees Fahrenheit for 7 consecutive days. Heavy snow blocked the mountain roads, cutting off supply deliveries and forcing every homestead to survive on whatever fuel and food they had stockpiled. For the first time since perfecting his methods, Caleb faced conditions that would challenge every component of his heating system simultaneously. The crisis began on a Monday morning when John Byrne appeared at Caleb's door with frost covering his beard and desperation in his voice. Byrne's cabin had dropped to 18 degrees inside during the night, despite burning his entire reserve of split oak in a desperate attempt to maintain heat. Ice had formed on the inside of his windows, and his water bucket had frozen solid 3 feet from his wood stove. Two other neighbors faced similar emergencies, their conventional heating methods overwhelmed by the sustained cold that seemed to pull warmth out of their cabins faster than any amount of fuel could replace it. What followed became a controlled experiment that demonstrated the difference between burning fuel and managing heat as an integrated system. While his neighbors battled the cold with increasingly desperate measures, Caleb's cabin maintained interior temperatures between 68 and 72 degrees using his established banking, refresh, and thermal management protocols. The contrast wasn't just about comfort, it was about survival in conditions that tested the limits of frontier heating technology. The key advantage emerged from how Caleb's various innovations worked together under extreme stress. The deep coal banking method provided steady base heat that didn't fluctuate with outside temperature changes. The thermal mass stones absorbed excess heat during the day and released it steadily through the night, preventing the temperature swings that plagued wood-burning systems. The sealed chinking prevented the infiltration of Arctic air that was defeating his neighbors' heating efforts. Most critically, the smoke trap and refresh protocols kept the system operating efficiently, even when the extreme cold affected chimney draft and combustion characteristics. Byrne and two other neighbors, Samuel Creek and James Whitman, tried to replicate Caleb's methods using their existing wood-burning equipment. But their attempts revealed why the integrated approach was essential. Creek attempted to bank wood coals under ash the way Caleb banked coal, but wood coals lacked the thermal mass and slow-burning characteristics needed for sustained heat output. Whitman tried sealing his cabin chinks with mud, but without thermal mass to stabilize temperatures, his sealed cabin experienced dramatic temperature swings that were worse than the drafty conditions he started with. The quantified results of the 7-day trial established the practical superiority of Caleb's system beyond any doubt. Temperature measurements taken every 4 hours showed that while outside temperatures varied from 0 to 20 below degrees, Caleb's cabin temperature varied only between 68 and 72 degrees. His neighbors' cabins fluctuated between 15 and 50 degrees, creating living conditions that were not just uncomfortable, but genuinely dangerous. The fuel consumption differences were equally dramatic. Caleb used approximately 1 load of coal equivalent during the 7-day period, while his wood-burning neighbors exhausted their entire winter fuel supplies and had to begin burning furniture and tools to maintain even minimal heat. The structural damage caused by extreme temperature cycling in poorly heated cabins provided additional evidence of the system's value. Creek's cabin suffered 2 cracked window panes when interior condensation froze and expanded. Whitman's door frame warped so badly from repeated freezing and thawing that his door wouldn't close properly. Byrne discovered splits in his cabin's chinking that would require extensive repair when spring arrived. Caleb's stable temperature environment prevented these freeze-thaw cycles, avoiding repair costs that would amount to several dollars, a significant expense for frontier families operating on subsistence budgets. The social dynamics of the trial period proved as important as the technical results. As word spread through the mountain community about Caleb's success during the cold snap, neighbors began visiting his cabin to experience the warmth and observe his methods firsthand. Mary Carson, who operated a supply business serving the local homesteads, spent an afternoon learning Caleb's banking techniques and left convinced that she should begin offering surface coal lumps along with advice on proper burning methods to her customers. Carson's commercial interest represented the beginning of the method's transition from individual innovation to regional practice. She understood that homesteaders who could heat their cabins more efficiently using less fuel would have more time and resources available for other frontier necessities. Within months of the cold snap trial, Carson was not only selling surface coal, but providing instruction in banking techniques, chinking materials, and stone placement methods that replicated the essential elements of Caleb's integrated system. The transformation of Caleb from neighborhood eccentric to recognized expert happened gradually through the spring and summer of 1891. Homesteaders who had dismissed his coal experiments began asking detailed questions about ash thickness, refresh timing, and thermal mass positioning. Tom Ridley, whose mining camp connections gave him credibility with practical men, began recommending Caleb's methods to new settlers who were planning their heating systems before their first mountain winter. By autumn, 3 families in the immediate area had implemented versions of Caleb's integrated approach, adapting his techniques to their specific cabin designs and available materials. The Hendricks family combined coal banking with improved chinking, but used local fieldstone instead of creekbed sandstone for their thermal mass. The Posies focused primarily on sealing and insulation improvements while continuing to burn wood, but incorporated Caleb's principles of controlled airflow and draft management. Each adaptation proved that the underlying principles could be applied flexibly while maintaining the core advantage of treating heating as a complete system rather than simply a matter of burning fuel. The spread of these methods through the local community validated what Caleb had discovered through necessity and experimentation. Frontier heating wasn't just about having enough fuel or building a hot enough fire. It required understanding how combustion, heat retention, air quality, and structural design work together to create comfortable, sustainable living conditions in harsh mountain environments. When you treat your cabin, your fuel, and your air as one integrated team working together, the old traditions of careful control and patient technique will outperform the wasteful frontier habit of simply burning more fuel every single time.